In Sydney, the harbour gets most of the attention, but this is the heart of the working city. It's called Martin Place, and you are surrounded by these grand Victorian and early 20th century buildings. Buildings that were once government, banking and insurance houses are now home to luxury brands. This part of Sydney is feeling better than ever. The game changer is Sydney's new light rail. Not only is it a great way to get around the city, it's also cleared out the congestion, the noise and the pollution of cars. Hi there and welcome to part 2 in this little Rusty Compass series on what's new in Sydney. This is the second in our guide to things that have changed in Sydney in recent years. There's quite a lot to talk about. Have a look at part 1 later and hit subscribe so we can travel some more together. At Rusty Compass, we're interested in the stories and beautiful places, and we're interested in history, architecture, and I guess we like to travel a little bit differently. If that sounds like the way you like to travel, stay with me. I hope we can give you some travel ideas you hadn't previously considered. Sydney's new light rail makes it easy to travel between the harbour, Chinatown and some inner city neighbourhoods. It's also made the centre of Sydney far nicer for walking. A walk along historic George Street has been transformed. It's not been possible to take a walk down the centre of Sydney's oldest street. This is a pretty cool development in the city. Sydney doesn't seem to have ever really been given proper credit as a city of architecture. The Opera House gets plenty of praise, but there's a city around it too. Look up as you walk for a taste of Sydney's architectural character. Sydney's oldest street is named after King George III. He was on the throne when colonisation occurred in 1788. He tends to be known as the Mad King and the last King of America. But he was also known as the first King of Australia. To make that happen back in the 1700s, all you needed to do was send ships around the world, find lands unoccupied by other Europeans, drop a flag in the dirt, and make a proclamation. There was no need to run all that by the people who'd been here 60,000 years beforehand. In 2023, Australians are thinking hard about all that again. It's a very interesting time to be travelling here. You really appreciate a car-free precinct when you suddenly find yourself back amongst cars at these intersections. This building is one of the colonial era icons of central Sydney. It only narrowly escaped demolition a few decades ago. It's gone on to become another high-end shopping centre. Like George Street, it references Sydney's links to colonial Britain. The Queen Victoria building opened in 1898, in the 67th year of her long reign, and just a few years before she passed away. In the centre of Sydney, you're never very far from a Queen Victoria statue. And nor are you ever far from reminders of Australia's continuing connection with the British Crown. One of the many curious things you'll discover about us is that our head of state isn't Australian and doesn't spend very much time here either. He has other pressing things to think about. If you're visiting Sydney, you probably don't even know that King Charles is the King of Australia. So another new thing in Sydney in 2023 is that the city has a new king. A good place to think about Australia and the monarchy is right here at the Colonial era Government House. This native Moreton Bay fig, said to date back to the opening of the building in the 1840s, has welcomed every royal visitor to Sydney since then. That includes the new king, his parents, and all your other favourite royals. I may be a reluctant subject of the new king, but Government House is an excellent place to visit during your time in Sydney. Government House opens to the public a few days a week. Links to a video about Government House are in the description. The new light rail has transformed the centre of the city, and now new bicycle and walking paths are making it easier to explore beyond. Today I'm going to head out to a place called Parramatta. The area around Parramatta in Sydney's west is where most of the city's residents live. It's a place that travellers to Sydney tend to stay away from. Sydney's a pretty segregated city, so if you have friends and family here, they might also tell you that there's no need to visit Parramatta. In my travels, I've often found places with mixed reviews like that to be some of the most interesting places to visit. Riding along some new cycling trails, I'm going to give you a look at Parramatta's unique connection with Australia's past. Starting with another, much older Government House. Government House Parramatta dates from 1799. That makes it the oldest standing public building in Australia. It's a symbol of the westward expansion of the colony from Sydney Harbour and the frontier wars and dispossession that accompanied that expansion. A short distance from Government House is a building that's a little bit older. It's known as the Derry Cottage and it dates from 1798. I'm not certain of it, but I'm going to guess that all of the surviving buildings from the 1700s in Australia are in Parramatta. Most people in Sydney don't even realise there's great cycling and incredible history out here, so don't be surprised if you don't see too much traffic on the bicycle paths. About 13% of the convicts that arrived in Sydney after 1788 were women. And from the 1820s, many of them ended up here at what was known as the Parramatta Female Factory. It's a terrible name for what must have been a pretty awful place. This whole precinct spent nearly 2 centuries as a place of incarceration of women. After a major restoration, the Female Factory precinct is now open to visitors. Hopefully there are plans to expand on the storytelling out here too. Next stop on my little ride, in the middle of suburban Parramatta, is Elizabeth Farm. So this is Australia's oldest colonial residence. It dates back to 1793. And it's a really impressive piece of heritage. But just as interesting is the man that built it. In the version of Australian history from the 1970s that I remember, John MacArthur was a hero, the founder of the wool industry. Wool pioneer MacArthur was commemorated on the $2 bill. But MacArthur was also a man of dubious dealings and scandal. Dive into the scandals of the early colony or just enjoy the gardens and the grounds. Parramatta only reluctantly acknowledges its place at the centre of colonial history and heritage in Sydney. It feels like it's been run by property developers for half a century or more. That's been a shame for the telling of really important Australian stories, and it's also been a shame for the local economy. But there are signs that things may be improving. Apart from the heritage stuff, the Parramatta area is one of Sydney's best culinary centres. Indian, Middle Eastern, Chinese and more. Head out for a look. For more on this Parramatta heritage experience, head over to rustycompass.com. You could easily make a visit to Australia a history of incarceration, and this wouldn't be a bad place to start. It probably shouldn't be surprising that as a former penal colony, so many pieces of Australian-built heritage were once places of incarceration. I'm in the grounds of the National Art School, and I've come here because recently, in the last few years, a new drawing gallery has opened here. I mentioned in the last video how fond I am of small museums. I'm also a big fan of small galleries. And in addition to the new drawing gallery, the National Art School has a couple of other interesting small galleries. This place is worth checking out as well. Before it became the National Art School in 1922, Darlinghurst Prison was the main prison in central Sydney. Notorious criminals were held here, 76 of them hanged. Many of the hangings took place right here in public. It's a good example of the panopticon prison design that was popular in the 19th century. Prisoners were always under observation. The old prison and the art school galleries are an excellent way to spend a few hours. You can also explore the dining, the pubs, and the photogenic delight that is the neighbourhood of Darlinghurst. We're not just interested in old prisons and sandstone buildings, we're also interested in the modern Sydney skyline. In recent years, it's seen some big changes. This is Sydney's tallest building. It opened in 2020 and it has been plagued by scandal since it was conceived. The thing that's creating controversy is that Sydney's tallest building, visible pretty much everywhere, is a casino. For the world's biggest gamblers, that might seem appropriate. But many Sydney-siders aren't happy about the idea that our national gambling addiction has such a prominent shrine in the centre of the city. Happily, there's a lot more to Barangaroo than the casino. There's a good collection of eateries and bars right by the harbour. When you push past the casino, you'll hit what for me is the highlight. That's the Barangaroo Reserve, a huge harbour foreshore parkland. This is a beautiful new public space in the heart of Sydney. Another one to add to Sydney's already impressive collection. Sydney's also famous for its harbour and ocean swimming pools. They're a big part of my life here. Most of them date back well over half a century. So it was great to see this new pool added to the collection in 2022. What a sweet spot, right in the middle of the city. Oh! And there are plans for more harbour pools in the coming years. After a dip, a cycle and a walk, this is a pretty good place to end the day. Before heading up to the historic rocks for a drink and a bite in an old Sydney pub. The buildings around Sydney's magnificent harbour are a bit of a mixed bag. There's a fair bit of fairly mediocre architecture. But a new arrival in the last couple of years has lifted the game a little. It's an unusual structure. Not only is it architecturally impressive, its eco-credentials are pretty impressive too. It's actually located right beside Sydney's first skyscraper, which is presently getting a bit of a renewal. I think this building is pretty cool. And I was also interested to discover that this is one of the first major projects in Sydney by Danish architects since the Sydney Opera House. I hope these Danes had a better experience of Sydney than Jorn Utzon. Utzon, the Dane that designed Sydney Opera House, ended up abandoning the project in 1966 because the Conservative New South Wales government made his work untenable. When the Opera House officially opened 50 years ago this year, Utzon was absent. His name wasn't mentioned. Happily, Sydney did finally make peace with Utzon and his family, though he never saw his creation, one of the world's most loved architectural works. As the Opera House turns 50, appreciation of the genius of Utzon is alive and well in Sydney and around the world. Thanks for joining me for part 2 in our series on new things in Sydney. I hope you've discovered some interesting things there. If you'd like to travel some more with us and also discover more about all the places referenced in these videos, you can head over to rustycompass.com. Of course, you can also subscribe to this channel, and if you'd like to travel with us in person, you can do that by joining a walk of history, big stories, beautiful places at oldcompasstravel.com. Thanks again, and see you soon.